What is post-secondary transition? Consider the question, what do you want for your child after they leave school? This will include research, using resources, and setting goals. It's a lot of information and there's a lot to consider. So trying to do it all at once can really feel consuming. It will be a unique experience, but there are other families who are going through this at the same time you are. So we're here having conversations that will ask parents to think long term. Welcome. This is the Post Secondary Transition Podcast. We have conversations around the process for families of students with disabilities. I'm one of the hosts. My name is Meghan Smallwood, and I'm a public school transition coordinator. And my co-host is...
I'm Patrick Cadigan. I am a public school special education teacher. And today we get to jump back into our interview format. Miss Meghan, do you want to set us up?
Sure thing. All right. Well, today we are with Laura Karp, who is a public day school occupational therapist. And we are fortunate to have her to talk about some of those functional IEP goals that I'm sure you as parents have heard about many times in an IEP meeting. But thank you, Laura, for joining us.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
We'll just start by, do you mind telling a little bit about your background and how you got into being an occupational therapist?
Yeah. So my name is Laura, and as you said, I'm an occupational therapist in a public separate day school in Maryland. I first learned about occupational therapy when I was in elementary school. My school had an inclusive preschool program, and one day a lady came in to play with kids. She had a trampoline in one hand and a bucket of Play-Doh in the other. And I thought to myself, wow, that lady gets to play all day. I want her job. When I was in high school, I started a Best Buddies chapter and ended up volunteering in that same special ed preschool classroom where I first saw the occupational therapist. And then after college, I taught high school biology for a couple years and then went to grad school to become an occupational therapist, or OT. And for the last 2 decades, I've been directing summer camps and overnight life skills programs for people with disabilities, and have been really interested in kind of the process of as they age out of school. So several years ago, I went back to school for my doctorate and wrote my dissertation on that transition into adulthood for young adults with disabilities.
Comment about the last summer piece? What's this?
Last summer, I became a master IEP coach after completing a course by Catherine Witcher. She has 25 years of IEP experience. And part of the course was really like re-looking at IDEA law and rethinking how we look at and how we implement IEPs. So some of the most important things that I learned from that course are that an IEP should always be focused on preparing a child for further education, employment, and independent living. And that we should think about tossing out old-fashioned IEP goals that don't make sense for a child's future. And the third lesson was that effective IEPs don't have more things, they have the right things. So I'm often in meetings where a child has 10 different goals, and I can't even imagine going into work and being expected, to do 30 or 40 different tasks, especially if they don't have meaning or purpose to me as a student.
I can totally think of a student I had in 8th grade when I taught middle school, getting ready to go to high school, and the transition high school meeting, the mom was so nervous about what he's going to need to accomplish in high school. They had at least 20 math objectives, no joke. And I remember looking at it thinking, oh my goodness, how are they going to tackle all this? But the mom was just so focused on more means it's a better IEP, right? But it wasn't, and it was tied to the curriculum, which, we want that exploration and exposure, but in retrospect, it would have been great to have more of those functional goals on there instead.
Yes, I think it's a common misconception that more is better, when in reality, there's a limited time in which these goals can be targeted. So the more goals and the more objectives, the less time the student has to practice each one.
I am sensing a whole can of worms with that type of discussion. However, before we dive into that discussion, one of the things that I think would be really helpful, Laura, is okay, obviously you're passionate about functional goals, but for those who are uninitiated, how would you define functional goals for an IEP?
To me, a functional goal targets a skill that is useful and practical outside the four walls of a classroom. So, for instance, I consider knowing what to wear when it's snowing outside, how to prepare a simple meal when you're hungry, or what various signs in the community mean to be functional goals, because all students will need to use these skills once they leave school.
So then in that regard, why are these functional goals so important to have on an IEP?
So research shows us that transition-aged youth, so people with disabilities from ages 12 to 24, are falling far behind their same-aged peers when it comes to post-secondary education, employment, and independent living. Focusing on interpersonal skills, so those communication skills, those social skills, and functional life skills early on in a student's educational career can lead to more successful transition outcomes.
It's interesting to hear you say that, talking about interpersonal and functional skills. There is a student that I am working with, and very recently, there was some struggles around him focusing on his computer, and it had actually gotten to the point where I consulted with the family and I said, look, I'm really thinking that the computer needs to take a hike. And they agreed, and kind of like in an interim capacity. And I will tell you that the team made that decision on a Friday, and I was really nervous about it. I lost sleep over the weekend because I just had no idea what was going to happen. And we've been going on a couple of weeks now, and I will tell you that this student has blossomed interpersonally. I've had teachers that I know come to me and be like, oh my gosh, said student said hi to me. And I'm like, okay. And, and again, this is a student who historically not communicated very well. So it is very prescient to hear about functional goals and those interpersonal skills, because it's become forefront to me probably this school year more than any other up to this point.
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head. It's such a partnership between the family and the IEP team and the school, right? I mean, there's a lot of families that I work with that I feel like they want to push off a lot of the functional, like, let me give them their 4 years in high school first, and then we'll talk about it. And there's a lot of questions. Well, why do they need to worry about this so early, when their same age peers are just focused on other things? So I think it's just that conversation. It's a hard conversation too to have, but it's an important one. Needs to happen.
I was going to say it's hard too, because neurotypical peers are getting a lot of practice opportunities with the functional skills. A lot of high school students have a part-time job, or, do chores around the house, might be responsible for younger siblings. So they're might be trusted to go out in the community, go to a shopping mall and buy things, go grocery shopping. And not all students with IEPs get those same opportunities to practice those life skills in a very practical setting where, it's not on purpose necessarily, but I think, most parents and families want to prepare their children for the future. And so for many students, it's embedded. For students with IEPs, we sometimes forget that, those life skills are incredibly important.
Yeah, totally agree.
Well, okay. So as we're continuing to lay the foundation for these functional goals that we're talking about, could you start with, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm going to a whole host of other questions that I have, but I want to make sure that we're very clear about what it is that we're doing. So could you give us some examples of functional goals in different areas?
Of course. One thing that I see in IEPs is there are many middle and high school students with reading and writing IEP goals for skills like identifying the main idea, characters, or setting, and developing a paragraph. These are often skills that students have been working on since elementary school. Functional IEP goals, on the other hand, tie mastered academic concepts and student strengths into skills that will help them in the future. For instance, functional reading goals might include reading a calendar, a schedule, or a weather forecast to gain needed information, like what to wear that day or what to pack in your backpack. And functional writing goals would include things like making a grocery list, filling out forms, or taking inventory. Similarly, with math, a lot of students have IEP goals for calculation, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, or identifying coins and bills. I was recently at an IEP for a student who had objectives like that, and the parent pointed out, but wait, my daughter doesn't know that, 5 is bigger than 1, that, a $5 bill is worth more than a 1. So while these math and calculation skills are important, tying them into an area of interest. So for this student, it was shopping, or other interests like cooking or leaving a tip at a restaurant can add meaning and engagement for students while also helping them to prepare for the future.
Yeah, and I love giving out the parent questionnaire every year for to kind of gauge like what kind of chores are they helping out with at home. What are their interests? And then I always use that like as a jumping off point. Like, oh, you said that they load the dishwasher. Can they unload the dishwasher? Or laundry? Laundry is a huge one. Like, okay, they can put the stuff in the machine, but do you have them transfer it? Can they match it? Like, there's so many skills. And that's something like that's a multi-step task. Like there's so many ways to tie it back to the IEP so that it's something that will carry on with them and is meaningful.
So then how do you know what subject areas to write goals for? Who helps with that type of input?
So I think Meghan just said it best. Best way to determine those areas is by seeking input from the student, from the family, and from the transition coordinator. The IEP team should be asking, what are the students' strengths? What are their preferences? What do they like to do? And what are the students' and families' goal for the future? So in my county, the 2 areas of the IEP that may assist with these questions are like the present levels and the transition planning pages. So I find those to be a great resource and starting point when developing new goals or determining other areas.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like talking to the family and the student of what their goal is, because a lot of times we kind of assume they all want the same thing after 21. Like I know for my one school, or they're all going to be employed. But that's if you talk to the family, that might not be what they're hoping for. So I think that kind of ties into another question that I had. How would you communicate functional goals to those families who are focused more on academics?
This piece is really tricky. Personally, I think we do a disservice to students and families by not bringing up the topic of transition and pushing for functional goals earlier in a student's academic career. Current research shows that less than 1 in 5, less than 20% of people with disabilities are employed, and less than 25%, or 1 in 4, people with disabilities live on their own. So to me, what these statistics mean is that our education system is not adequately preparing children with disabilities for that transition to adulthood. And when a parent or teacher is focused solely on academics, I try really hard to hone in on the student's strengths, preferences, and goals for the future, and guide the IEP team towards embedding goals that are both meaningful and functional for the student. Sometimes families aren't ready, and that's okay. But as members of an IEP team, I think it's really important to remind families of how many more years of special education and related services the student has, that unfortunately many of those services drop off after graduation, and the number of young adults with disabilities that end up sitting at home with nothing to do. So I think, the reality is heartbreaking for many, and it makes sense that people aren't ready to see it or acknowledge it. But as a member of an IEP team, I do feel that it's important to always advocate for IEP goals that will help to best prepare our students for the future.
It is interesting to hear you talk about this because I am the 8th grade teacher. So for my students this year, transition has started. And then, of course, in our county, we're making the bigger push towards focusing more on the transition piece within the IEP. So this year was the first year. And then, of course, playing off of what we're doing with all these different conversations and the websites that we've done, to wanting to be in the forefront of having that discussion. But just going through and kind of like, as I'm hearing you talk, I'm like, hey, you know what? This year, when I sat down and did my student interviews and when I did my career preference interest forms and making sure to reach out to the families and then asking them what they thought. And then when it came to writing those present levels, like kind of weaving it all in and making it somewhat of a narrative. And, it seemed to me to be a really good idea, but
No, I agree, though. I think, it's so important. And I know it's hard when it's the younger age, they might not be ready, but I think we just have to keep exposing it. And every family, it clicks for them at different times. So I think just as long as all members of the team and, everyone involved is expressing the importance of it and coming from different perspectives on how it'll help, ultimately the family will see it before, hopefully not too late before they graduate. But you're right, the time is so limited. It's better to work on it now while they can. So that kind of goes into my next question. How can the functional goals help to prepare our students for transition? What are they going to do to help us?
So functional goals can help prepare students for transition by focusing on skills that students will need once, as you guys say, the school bus stops coming. Mm-hmm. Every student is different and their strengths and their needs vary widely. So this might look different for every single student, like on someone's caseload. But outside of academics, so outside of the reading, writing, and math related functional goals I spoke about earlier, functional IEP goals can be included in the area of independent community living. And so these types of goals can be based on the community, on work or recreation and leisure skills. For example, if the family wants to prioritize community safety, cleaning, tidying, organizing, or making a meal, this type of functional IEP goal would be most appropriate in helping to prepare the student for the transition from high school to adulthood.
I will say one thing I've learned over the years when we go to visit like day programs, one of the big things that they really look for are behaviors. Is there some self-regulation strategies for the student that they've learned, but also the personal hygiene and the safety. So how are they at, handling all those activities of daily living? And if they take them in the community, are they going to recognize community signs? Are they going to be safe? Will they look both ways before they cross the street? So those functional things are just so embedded in what life could be like if they go to a day program after the fact.
Right. And I think that because many IEPs are so focused on those academic skills of ABCs and 1, 2, 3s, we give students who long-term may be going to a day program, we don't give them the time, the opportunities to practice, and that direct instruction in those community signs and the activities of daily living.
I also feel like, and I'm sure you see this too, by doing our job so well, we're over prompting a lot of the times, because we want to make sure they get it right, but we don't necessarily give them time for trial and error to make a mistake and learn. So I know it's like this fine line of we want you to do it, but we want you to do it right. And yeah, there's a lot of pieces to it.
Again, my brain always kind of goes to that. We're talking essentially about two different tracks of students, right? You have students who we know who are working towards graduating with the diploma, and then those students who are not. And those level of needs can be different, and in some cases, like significantly different, significantly varying. That is something that I am constantly thinking about. So, but again, I can appreciate this discussion around having functional goals because, again, there are students who I'm working with that genuinely struggle to have interpersonal relationships or interpersonal communication or, just things like that.
Yeah, that's also very hard too. I know, because Laura, I know you're at a comprehensive school and you're at the separate day school. So you see a lot of the mix. And I know at my comprehensive school, there's very little time in the day to focus on these important functional things. And I know we've sat in an IEP meeting where we recognize the need for it because you see those glimmers during the day, but the parent, many times in situations I've been in, kind of dismiss it like, oh no, we'll help them at home. We'll take care of it at home. It's not seen as an important thing to work on.
And one thing that I have started doing in some of those instances is meeting with the IEP team about ways that we can embed it into the IEP without making it a goal or an objective. For instance, I've had families that, want their child to be able to wipe their face or their clothing after a meal. And so adding that rather as a goal and objective, but as a supplementary aid and service. So providing a social story or some visuals like a mirror and wipes to help the student learn the skill. And then adding into the IEP, like encourage student to like check and wash face after a meal. So it's not necessarily a goal, something that, data is being collected on, but it's still something that we're able to embed and practice because the student will be eating at school every day. And that way the team is able to monitor and, report how they're doing if that's an area of concern for the teacher or the family.
That's a great idea on how to track it and keep it accountable too, but it also highlights the importance of it.
I have to admit that as we've had this discussion, I was also thinking about that, but then again, thinking about it in terms of like, oh, hey, is that really something that I could throw in to a supplemental aid or something? So it's nice to hear you say that and be like, okay, yeah, yes, I can. Thank you.
Confirmed. Totally possible.
Especially as, you were just saying, Meghan, if that is the type of skills that the day programs are looking for, like it's so important for us to prepare our students for what comes next. And I think, that's a simple way to add it in.
Exactly.
Make sure it's practiced. It's something that classroom staff can easily like learn and help with. It's a good skill for all students,
Yeah.
Even if it's only on a couple of their IEPs.
And that's, I think, when we start looking at programs and it comes down to, we've talked about eligibility versus entitlement. And you have two individuals that the program's looking at and they can only take one. I mean, they're going to look at those kinds of skills. Well, who's going to require less assistance from a staff who has 5 or 6 in a group? An individual kid who can wipe their face off, who might go to the bathroom by themselves, who might be able to, be a little more safe. So it's so important and something, like you said, all school staff could easily try out with the whole class. Obviously there's going to be different levels of it, but at least giving them that opportunity to attempt.
And again, playing off of that, I mean, we've had conversations with people who run programs and they have said that they are looking for people who have a certain set of skills so that, can kind of fit into the overall program. And, sometimes, a higher level of need presents a different set of challenges.
So then, thinking of the different levels of our students, is it possible to change these functional goals for our students, whether it be simplifying them or making them more difficult or complex?
Of course, like all IEP goals, functional goals should be individualized to the unique needs of each student. So once that goal area, whether it's academic, community, or work, is determined, then the team needs to get a measurable baseline. What can the student do on their own, completely independently? If they're requiring support, how many prompts, what types of prompts are required, and how accurate is the student, given the prompts and supports. And then we can modify the goal. So, for instance, let's say a family wants their child to be able to prepare a meal. A simplified goal might be to mix pre-measured items in a bowl. So maybe like making a salad where all the ingredients from a bag where all the ingredients are already measured out, or to heat up a prepared meal in the microwave. A more challenging goal would be to have a student prepare a meal that requires measuring, mixing, baking, or boiling, depending on their safety awareness, of course. And either way, the IEP team would split up the functional goal into measurable and achievable pieces, which we call objectives, that the student can work on throughout the course of the IEP in order to achieve that overall skill of preparing a meal.
And going back to what you were saying before about those functional areas, like as if they were related to reading or writing, my thinking goes to filling out a job application. Being able to sit down and knowing what information to put in the job application, recognizing what information that they don't have and that they will have to ask help for in order to figure it out. So yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, and I think of that and I think of all the levels that come with it. Like it could just be recognizing their name in print or carrying a card that they know to hand to someone if they're asked what their information is. So yeah, like Laura said, there's so many different ways to customize it. And then I like when you're talking about, preparing for a meal, like it's a great way for families to practice too. And it could be something as simple as having them put their bowl in the sink when they're done. I think a student can do at least one part of it, because I know so many times I hear families say, well, no, they're not capable. No, there's a part that they are capable of. We just have to find it.
Right. And I think that is part of the beauty of both special education and occupational therapy, that we both have that strengths-based focus. Let's figure out what the student can do and kind of base the learning on that. Like, can we stretch it a little more? They can do one step. By the end of the year, can they do 2 steps, right? They can do the 5 steps of hand washing. By the end of the year, can they, also wash their face, whatever it might be.
Right. And then I love hearing the success stories from the families when they actually do see it come to fruition and they're like, oh my gosh, they're doing it independently now. So it just makes it all worth it.
One of the things that I don't think that I appreciated, Laura, is the fact that you do have a doctorate. So you came into it looking from the school system, looking at the practical application, right? Like this is what we're doing. Like this is the way that the school system does it. But then through your doctoral program, hearing you bring that level of information to it, like the statistics and the things that you had mentioned earlier, it just, again, it kind of makes me think about it on a level that I had not thought about it before as it relates to the introduction of transition. Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting to me.
Well, it's just amazing to see how it all ties in together.
Yeah, did that make sense? Did I just sound like a dork?
I could see the wheels turning.
I know the direction that I wanted to go in. I don't know if I got there, but it.
I mean, I think it's challenging because in any post-secondary program, they're focused on, all right, we're teaching from the evidence, like we're teaching these best practices. And there are best practices in special education, but in reviewing literally thousands of articles in the transition literature, like some of those best practices are missing. And so while like diving deep into that literature of that transition, it was disheartening to see that a big part of the problem is that lack of evidence, that, there are practices that will help. And because of that, I really focused my research on, okay, what is evidence-based?
Yeah.
So peer support is evidence-based, starting early. So working on these functional skills earlier and earlier is evidence-based. Using visuals and social stories is evidence-based. But there's nothing that, points to, okay, this is the key to success. Like, do this and everything will be magic. So school, where you're in the ideal, and, where we're all working in that public education, that practical setting.
Well, in playing off of that, I recently had a conversation with some friends that Meghan and I made in Wisconsin, and that is a future discussion that we're going to have where we'll have a chance to sit down and talk with them. But through the course of that conversation, one thing that I thought was really interesting was that they were able to break down transition within their state based on geolocation, because the way that they described it is that if you were in southern Wisconsin, then the transition skills that they were going to navigate you towards were different than the ones that if you were in northern Wisconsin, just based on their economy and what they do and in the different areas. And again, it was something that I had not thought of before, even though many times we say that transition itself is very individualized. So it was just a very enlightening conversation to have. And I was fascinated to hear those differences.
Makes sense, especially considering the community supports that teachers or families or transition coordinators, might be utilizing to help get students out into the community. You're going to use whatever's around you. But that's fascinating that, they were able to mark such a difference based on geography.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to talking with them and kind of delving a little bit deeper into it, because one of the things that had also come up in that conversation, Meghan and I had just finished having our discussion around healthcare transition, and just I didn't prompt the conversation, but as I met with this group, the first thing out of their mouth was healthcare transition. And I was like, okay. So, and I was worried because that they were in Wisconsin that I wasn't going to know what they were talking about. But as it turns out, as the conversation progressed, there's a lot of common language, which made it very helpful. And and again, in being able to dive into the differences, and then figuring out, well, who does what differently and why do they do it that way. And when they talked about their interactions with the school system, it again, it sounded very different than the interactions in the school system that we have gotten used to. And speaking of the differences from state to state, let me use this as a segue very quickly to throw out our Well, That's Helpful resource for this week. Now, we're going to highlight a discussion that I recently came across from Disability Rights Florida. The most recent conversation on their podcast, You First, has two parent advocates, and they discuss the nuances of the IEP process. But my ears really perked up when they started a discussion on transition, and more specifically, what it looks like in the state of Florida. So there will be a link in the show notes to that specific discussion. But in general, Disability Rights Florida has done a really nice job on their You First podcast, and I champion anyone to subscribe to it. They have a lot of thoughtful discussions that I personally have found useful. So look them up either at their website or on your podcast platform of choice. And like I said, there will be a link in the show notes. And once again, another outside the state resource.
Yeah, I find that so interesting to hear how it differs from state to state. And I think it's handy for parents to hear too, because I know, when you're thinking of long-term goals and maybe you want to retire in a different state, well, you really have to become familiar with what is available there and what would work for your family. But what would work? Functional IEP goals. Just tying it back there.
Boom. All right. So We were on a divergent conversation, like the old fork in the road, but then Meghan brought it right back. Brilliant.
Yep.
Brilliant. All right. Meghan, do you have anything else?
No, I think that was.
Well, brilliant. Well, I will tell you what, I would say that was a full conversation. And
That was good.
yeah,
Thank you so much, Laura.
yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it.
That definitely got me thinking about it in a different way.
No, that was perfect tie-in, and like the focus, I think this year especially has really been how can we start earlier? What can we do to get families in earlier, especially with the middle school, push. So I think this is perfect.
Well, that was a very cool conversation. It's nice to be back in and talking with people.
Agree, and I love hearing the real life stories and how it really can fit in, and it all ties together.
It does all tie together. All right. Well, with all of that being said, follow the information from this conversation in our show notes. Like, follow, and please share out the podcast. We are looking to spread the word to as many families that are going through this process as we can. Visit our YouTube channel. We've posted videos of all of our conversations, including doing some of the legwork for you. We've curated videos of topics that revolve around transition that include playlists. They cover guardianship, alternatives to guardianship, able accounts, and there is always more to come the more videos we find. So be sure to subscribe there as well. And then finally, check out our website, which is chock full of information around the transition process. At this time, I am very comfortable to say that we have now officially moved over to what would be considered version 2.0 of the website. It has been refreshed and rewritten from the ground up, so go check it out, www.postsecondarytransition.com. And we are looking forward to more pages and more conversations in the future. All right. Well, there we go. And we have, I believe that we have another conversation coming up very soon.
We do. I'm excited for it.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't say conversation because we're always having conversations. Another interview.
Yes.
All right. Well, then we're looking forward to that. So then please come back and listen to us anytime. We really appreciate it. And we'll talk with you soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.